Hello, welcome to episode 5 of Taking It Further. This series of short videos that covers some of the things that we're not able to cover on our normal Sunday mornings. Last Sunday, which was the 8th of November 2020, we were looking at 2 Kings chapter 11, which is the story of Athaliah and the boy king Joash. And next Sunday, the 15th of November, we are going to be looking at 2 Kings chapter 19. And between the end of 2 Kings 11 and the beginning of, and 2 Kings 18, there is about 120 years of history. So I thought it might be useful just to very quickly skim over that story. If you've got a Bible, it would be really handy to have it open, and as you just flick between 2 Kings 11 and 2 Kings 18, you'll see that it's just kind of small paragraph after small paragraph of so-and-so king of Israel, so-and-so king of Judah. So there's quite a lot going on in terms of kings. I've found that one of the most helpful way to try and make sense of passages like this or work out what's going on is actually just to kind of literally sit down with the passage and a piece of paper and a pencil and just kind of try and make some kind of sense, a bit like that, some sense of what's going on in terms of who's the king, how long they were king for, were they a good king, tick, were they a bad king, cross, and try and work out where the different kings come in terms of each other. Also, if you've got a study Bible, I mean, I've got the NIV Life Application Bible, but the study Bible will almost certainly have some kind of chart inside with the kings of Judah, the kings of Israel, and also quite helpfully the prophets who overlap with the different kings. So we left our story let's have a look at this slide. So we had a couple of weeks ago we saw that that Jehu became king of Israel after killing both the king of Israel and the king of Judah, both of whom were either the son or the grandson of the king Ahab. Athaliah decided that rather than anyone else become king, she was going to become queen, so she killed a whole bunch of princes. But we saw last week that Joash was smuggled away for 6 years, and so at the end of chapter 11 you've got Joash becoming the king of Judah, and he is a direct descendant of David. So it'll be helpful to just kind of skim through the chapters as we talk, but I would encourage you to afterwards to go away and to read the whole thing. Chapter 12 is about Joash repairing the temple and some of the things that he did. And then so we move into chapter 13, and we see that Jehoahaz becomes king after his father Jehu dies, and Jehoahaz spends a lot of time under pressure from Hazael, who is the king of Aram. But in chapter 13 and verse 4 we read that he did seek the Lord's favour. Even though he was a king that did evil in the eyes of the Lord, he did seek the Lord's favour, and God sent a deliverer. Joash had quite a long reign, and these slides aren't intended to be to scale or anything like that. Jehoahaz reigned for 17 years, and then he was replaced by Jehoash. This is still in chapter 13. There's an interaction between Jehoash and Elisha, and we read just kind of one line in chapter 13 verse 20. Elisha died and was buried. That's the end of Elisha's story. But while Jehoash was still king in Israel, Amaziah replaces Joash as king in Judah. And although Amaziah was able to defeat Edom and a few other kings, he spent a lot of his time being challenged by Israel, by first of all Jehoash, and also then by his son Jeroboam II. And Judah was routed by Israel at this time. So it wasn't a good time for Judah. And as I say, Jehoash was replaced after 16 years by Jeroboam II. Jeroboam II was going to reign for 41 years. And then if we move all over to the left, so we're going from left to right, 27 years into Jeroboam II's reign, Azariah, who sometimes is called Uzziah, becomes king. Azariah, as Amaziah and Joash before him, it says, did good in the eyes of the Lord. Some of them, as you read through, it will say that they did good in the good in the eyes of the Lord, but they didn't, and they went so far, but not the whole way. But I'll leave you to read through the different kings. So where are we up to? Azariah. Okay, so when Azariah has been king for 38 years, we then come into a period of a number of short reigns in Israel, and we're getting into a period now where kings, rather than being replaced by their sons, we do find, as we progress in Israel's story, we find kings being assassinated and replaced by someone who assassinated them. So Jeroboam is succeeded by a king called Zechariah, who was only king for half a year. And Zechariah is the final king in the line of Jehu. Remember that God said to Jehu, you would have somebody on the throne to the fourth generation. Zechariah is that fourth generation. And he is replaced by a guy called Shallum, who was only king for 1 month. And then Menahem, who is king for 10 years. And at this time, Assyria, so let me just put up, where's it gone? Let me put up this slide. So Assyria was the major superpower of the day. Their capital city was Nineveh, which is in modern day Iraq. And the Assyrian Empire, obviously they kind of stretches and shrinks as battles happen, but it stretches right from the Persian Gulf, which is not on this map, it's over to the east of this map, stretches from the Persian Gulf around the Fertile Crescent and down through Israel and Judah eventually, and then even at times kind of stretching into Egypt. But as I say, at various points the empire grew and shrank, but that's roughly the area. So that's the Assyrian Empire. And so we were up to King Menahem, and he came under pressure from Assyria. He was invaded, so this is the king of Israel, invaded or threatened by Assyria, and he paid them off. As you read through, you'll find a number of the kings kind of raiding the temple treasury and their palace treasuries to pay off the invaders, and so Assyria withdrew. You then have two similarly sounding kings following on from Pekahiah and Pekah. And again, when we get to Pekah, so Pekahiah only ruled for 2 years. Pekah was on the throne for 20 years, so that we're now up to kind of 50 years into Azariah's reign. And again, the Assyrians were threatening the borders. A king called Tiglath-Pileser, and he was an Assyrian, and he took parts of the northern part of Israel, and the people were deported back to Assyria, and foreigners were imported. And so we are up to 2 Kings chapter 15 at this point. Again, moving all over to the left. So 2 years into Pekah's 20-year reign, Jotham becomes king in Judah. He was to reign for 20 years. He was to do good in the eyes of the Lord. And Pekah was to join forces with the king of Aram and to kind of give quite a lot of hassle and aggro towards Judah. Jotham was succeeded by King Ahaz, and Ahaz did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And in chapter 16, verses 1 to 4, we read a bit more detail about that, but it says, he even sacrificed his son in the fire, engaging in the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. So Ahaz was a particularly evil king, and although he's getting a lot of aggro from Pekah and the king of Aram, and so he turns to the king of Assyria and offers him money and treasures from the temple, and asks for his help. And so Tiglath-Pileser comes against the king of Israel and against parts of that kingdom, and takes part of Israel. So Ahaz was a particularly bad king. I mean, one of the things that he did do was to, after he'd got help from Tiglath-Pileser, he went to Damascus and saw the altar that the king of Assyria had, and he got someone to copy it. And so that when he came back to Jerusalem, there was a model. There was kind of the rather than the temple, the altar that was supposed to be in the temple, he had it replaced by an altar that mirrored what the Assyrians were using, and used that instead. So he did lots of evil in the eyes of the Lord. 12 years into Ahaz's reign, Hoshea becomes king of Israel, and Hoshea only reigns for 9 years before disaster happens, and we're going to be looking at this part of the story on the 13th of December, and so this is chapter 17 of 2 Kings, where Israel, the northern kingdom, is exiled. This happened in 722 BC. They're taken into exile, and 2 Kings 17 verse 7 is very clear. All this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, etc., etc., etc. And so because of their continual sin against God, they were taken into exile. 3 years into Hoshea's reign, Hezekiah becomes king of Judah, and so we're now into chapter 18, and whereas a number of the previous kings had been good in the eyes of the Lord, but they hadn't done X, Y, or Z, Hezekiah is looked on very favourably. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, just as his father David had done, and then it lists kind of a number of the extra things that he did that the previous kings hadn't done. And so Hezekiah has been king for 6 years before Israel in the north is taken into exile by Assyria. Shalmaneser was the king at the time. And so that's where we're going to leave it today. We're going to pick up, we're looking at 2 Kings chapter 19 on Sunday the 15th of November. I'll put the link to the previous Sunday and the coming Sunday in the notes underneath this video. But we're going to pick up the story very briefly into 2 Kings chapter 18 and then look in a bit more detail at 2 Kings chapter 19. So we pick up the story 120 years after where we dropped it off last time. Hezekiah is now king in Judah. He is a good king, and Israel has been taken into exile by the Assyrians. Okay, so I will see you on Sunday the 15th.